You probably clicked on this video because it's right around the time when you're thinking about starting your seeds. Great. Now, let's reuse some of these plastic containers that you probably have lying around your house for seed starting. And what's nice about this is that it not only saves you money because you don't have to go out and buy special trays for starting your seeds, but it also produces less waste. Welcome to True Freedom Permaculture, where I show you all the tips and tricks you need to have a green thumb, even if you weren't born with one. Let's get started. Here's what you'll need in order to do this. Nothing too complicated. We have seeds, obviously. I'm about 12 weeks away from my last frost date here. So today I'm seeding some watermelon, I have some celeriac, and I also have some celery seeds. You are also going to need some potting soil. I like organic potting soil, but choose whatever suits you. They do sell specific seed starting mix, and I remember one year I didn't have any, so I just used potting soil, and all of my seedlings came up just fine. So I never looked back, and I never bought specific seed starting mix personally ever again, and I just used the potting mix. You are also going to need some water. You're going to need some plastic containers. I try not to buy a lot of things that come in plastic containers, but I'm not perfect, and sometimes I have to, and more so during the winter because my garden isn't producing, so I have to buy my produce at the store. So I have things like these salad containers that have the lids on them, and this is from like those packets of like seaweed sheets. I have some dishwasher tabs, so this is the bucket from that, and an egg carton. You're also going to need a sharp object, something like a tiny screw. You could use a nail. This is like a screwdriver from a toolkit that I have. You could even use a knife, a marker, some tape, and finally, this is a wonderful use for old baking dishes or baking trays. You can literally get them from your thrift store for maybe $1, maybe a couple dollars, but these are also some old pie plates that I have. You can see I use these every year, so this one has a bunch of rust on the bottom. That's okay, because you're not putting food in them, you're just using them to catch the water. So I like to put these underneath my seed trays so that way when I water them, if I get some on the floor, it doesn't ruin the floor underneath my trays. First, I'm going to take my sharp object of choice and poke some holes in the bottom of my plastic containers. This allows excess water to drain from the soil and decreases the chance of your delicate seedling roots rotting and thus killing your seedlings. It's a fine balance because you need to keep this environment, which is essentially a mini greenhouse, pretty humid, which is why plastic containers with lids are perfect, but you also need to allow excess water to escape from the container. When you're selecting which container to use for which crop, make sure you're thinking about the root system of that crop and how shallow or deep it is. Based on that, you can choose the best container for it. For example, if you're growing something like lettuce, which have shorter root systems, a shallow container is going to be just fine. Whereas if you're growing a crop with a deeper root system, like spinach, that shallow container won't be sufficiently deep for that long. Before you start filling your containers, you're going to want to label them so you can keep track of what's what. Because I know I will be moving my celery and celeriac seedlings to larger containers shortly after they've germinated, I'm using a shallow container, in this case this egg carton, and that will work just fine. If you have a surface that's a little difficult to write on because it's uneven, like the seaweed container, this is where your tape is going to come in handy. Just slap a piece of tape on it, and then it'll be really easy to write on the surface. This container didn't have a lid, but I did have a duplicate container. So what I did is I took a piece of tape and I used that to make a hinge out of the two separate containers, and that way it could be covered. Now that I have drainage holes in all of my containers and they're all labeled, I'm going to start filling them with my soil. As I was mentioning earlier, I do tend to favor organic potting mix. I have heard of some people sterilizing their own soil by putting it like on a baking sheet and baking it in the oven. If you want to do that, more power to you. I just decided not to dedicate the time to that and to just go out and buy the potting mix for myself, but your situation might be different. You do, however, want to make sure, no matter how you arrive there, that you're using a sterile potting mix. And don't just go bringing in some soil from the outdoors and putting it into your seedling containers thinking that you can cut some corners. The reason why is because that soil can contain insects, and you don't want to necessarily bring those indoors, as well as it could contain bacteria, which could affect your seedlings negatively. Also, that soil most likely contains other seeds. One time I had these basil seedlings that were coming up so beautifully. However, I tried to use soil from my backyard, not knowing any better, and it turns out it had tons of grass seeds in it. So all season long I was getting this beautiful basil, but I had to weed individual blades of grass that were growing around it, and it was just a nightmare. So don't do that, take it from me. At this point, you're ready to plant your seeds according to the instructions. Now, these are just a few ideas, but the sky is really the limit. Takeout containers are great. I just don't have any because we're not getting much takeout these days, but you can ask your friends, your coworkers, and your neighbors. I'm sure they will all have plenty that you can use. You can also use old cake containers as a dome over other containers to create that greenhouse effect. So like the large kind of sheet cakes, they come with usually like a black plastic bottom and then like a rectangular domed lid. It's so great to reuse plastic containers because one of the main reasons people decide to start their own garden is to save money. So why spend additional money on starting seeds if you don't have to? If you have a way of reusing a plastic container for starting seeds that I haven't mentioned, people would love to hear about it, myself included, so please feel free to share it in the comments. Next, you'll water them so the soil is barely damp. You don't want to douse them with water so they're soaking, or else your seeds might rot and you also might displace the seeds, especially if they're really tiny. Once you're done, place your lid over the container, or you could also use one of those plastic produce grocery bags on top of your container to retain moisture. You want to see condensation built up after a day or so. I'm going to share a mistake that I made with you in the hopes that you will learn from my mistake. But I planted these about 10 days ago. I just wasn't really thinking about it and I put them in this container. Now, there's a couple things wrong with this container. Number one, there are no drainage holes on the bottom. And number two, it's a pretty shallow container and you can already see how tall these seedlings are. Onions have a somewhat intricate and deep root system, so this container is just not going to be sufficient enough for their roots. So today I'm going to transfer them into this container so that way deeper root systems can form. I'm sharing this with you for those of you who have already planted inside a container that's not appropriate for what you're growing, so that way you can see how I transplant. As to be expected, right after I transplanted them, they were a little sad and droopy because they went through some transplant shock. They were like, where are we? But then in a day or two, they really started to perk up. So as you can see, I've got some that are standing tall. I'm probably going to give these a trim pretty soon actually, but they're doing just fine. Take all of your seedlings and place them in a warm spot in your home. They don't need light at this point, but they will soon. Wait patiently, and soon enough you should see the first peak of green coming out of your soil. Now, within your reused plastic greenhouses, you have essentially created a microclimate in that the area in these plastic containers is more humid and warmer than the environment around it. If you'd like to learn more about microclimates, how you can scale them up, and some specific examples of how you can think about them when you're planning your garden, you can click on this video coming up, and I will see you over there.